So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to this event this evening run by the Global Cultures Institute. My name is Daniel Orrells. I'm Professor of Classics here at King's in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and I'm currently the Director of the Institute. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight to listen to this first event in our new series, How We Argue. The Global Cultures Institute was founded in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities in 2023 to talk across boundaries. We live in a moment when culture has become the site of polarizing debate and intensifying divisions, whether these follow the contours of national, political, linguistic, disciplinary, sexual, racial, or other forms of difference. In this moment, cultural boundaries begin to take on the character of heavily policed borders. What might we do to find routes around, over, or even through these obstructions? How might we set about undermining them and the national and international institutions and systems by which they are sustained? Are there ways in which, to begin with, we might continue to converse across these boundaries, or at least to map and understand them? How can we understand these boundaries and their deconstruction in their deeper historical contexts? So the Institute exists to address these challenges through research, education, and public and community engagement. It draws on and fosters extensive interdisciplinary networks within King's and beyond, as well as our expertise in arts and humanities. We're the home to the research centre Language Acts and Worldmaking, which examines language as a material and historical force which acts as the means by which individuals construct their identities. We're also home to the research centre Queer at King's, an interdisciplinary group of scholars, students, and activists who work in gender and sexuality studies. Every year, we support our own research and education fellowship schemes, which allow academic colleagues to apply for large-scale external research grants and develop innovative education programs with new audiences outside of King's. We host reading groups, film screenings, talks, workshops, conferences, and other online engagement activities. So the Global Cultures Institute is hugely thrilled to be hosting this event on thinking about the arguments that people make about immigration. As I just mentioned, this is the first event in our series called How to Argue, which we've set up not to talk directly about contentious topics, but rather to explore how we talk about those topics. In this series, then, we want to think about the following sorts of questions. What shapes does a particular argument take? How do arguments and dialogue break down and fail? Where and when do arguments succeed? How do we judge the nature of that success? How do we tell the difference between a good and a bad argument? And does it make a difference whether we argue in person, on paper, in print, or online? Now, apart from the print and online dimensions, these are issues which have exercised the sharpest of minds from at least Socrates, that famous practitioner of dialogic thinking, onwards. So it gives me great pleasure then to hand over to our very own Professor Bobby Duffy, who's Director of the King's Policy Institute, to provide a further introduction to our event. Thank you very much.
Great. Oh, very nice. Thank you. Very nice. Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. That's great. And as Dan says, I'm Bobby Duffy, Director of the Policy Institute here at King's, and it is a real pleasure to be chairing the first of these events for the Global Culture Institute, and focused on immigration. And that's a subject that's really close to my heart and to my work. I've focused on attitudes to immigration on and off for over the past 20 years or so. In fact, one of my favorite studies, which I just found yesterday as we're clearing out our office, was this monster of a report that we did back in 2014, where we tried to pull together as much as we could find on people's attitudes and the realities around immigration, to try to be as comprehensive and neutral as possible in our collection of the evidence. So I reread the intro to this, and we did acknowledge that we're going to certainly fail on both counts in being both missing some information, and you can never be entirely neutral about these types of things. But it felt really important back then to try to bring that evidence together, because there was so much heat in the argument back in that kind of early 2010s. And there still is now. Immigration is a top 3 issue, and when in all of the polling that asks what's the most important issues facing the country, immigration alongside health and the economy keeps coming top and near the top. So it's still the case. And the intro also points out how evidence on opinion in realities are so often very selectively used to win arguments or to try to sell particular positions to the public and others. And that is just as true today as it was back then. So if there's anyone in the audience who knows a source of funding for us to update this 11 years later, do tell me. It was one of my favorite things to work on, and it was an absolute horror to do as well, to bring it all together, but we would still love to do it again. So one of the key messages from our wider work on perceptions and misperceptions is that these debates are not just about facts or direct experience. Facts and direct experience are important, but they're also about values and identity, which partly explains why they're often so heated and difficult to find either common ground or even to successfully disagree and argue. So tonight's session, as Dan outlined, is focused less on the rights and wrongs of different positions, but more on the how. And Dan listed very helpfully the types of questions that we hope to get to in the discussion. I guess I would add to that, in the end, understanding what are the unhelpful patterns into which arguments too readily fall, and how we might do that differently and more productively is kind of the focus for this type of session. So that's what we're going to try to do in this. Let's see how we go. It is really difficult in these types of discussions to separate the process from the subject itself, but we will be trying to do that. And obviously you need to illustrate some of the process points with some of the subject, but let's see how we get on. And we couldn't have a better panel to attempt that task. So they'll each give us thoughts for 7 or so minutes, then we'll have a bit of discussion coming back to each other on those types of things, and then we've got plenty of time for questions from you. So first up, we're going to hear from Sunder Katwala, who is Director of British Future, the think tank, and was previously General Secretary of the Fabian Society, and is the author of How to Be a Patriot, Why Love of Country Can End Our Very British Culture War. Then we'll hear from David Goodhart, who's the founding editor of Prospect magazine, currently head of demography, immigration and integration at Policy Exchange. And David's written a number of books that are very relevant to this, particularly maybe The Road to Somewhere and The British Dream, which was runner-up for the Orwell Prize back in 2014 as well, actually, David, around the time of this report. And then we'll hear from Miranda Green, who is Deputy Opinion Editor at the Financial Times. Also helped to found The Day, which assists schools in teaching current affairs to teenagers, a key task related to this, and worked for the Liberal Democrat Party in the House of Commons from 1995 into the 2000s. So, as I say, brilliant panel for this sort of discussion, just the types of people that we need. And I'm going to go straight over to Sunder to kick us off.
Thanks, Bobby. It's great to be kicking off this whole How to Argue series. British Future non-partisan think tank. We're interested in how to have a confident, inclusive, changing society. And one of our big themes is that to do that well, you've got to take the debates about identity, such as immigration, race, integration, and work out how to find common ground on issues that people will feel differently about for lots of different reasons. So how to talk about immigration as well as what the policies should be is almost the defining test of that kind of agenda. And you can see in the world, America, Britain, Europe, you can see it's very difficult. There's a very polarized debate. So I just want to describe a polarized debate about immigration and listen to some of what's going on. Immigration debates are often driven by the people who are very worried about immigration and how that's going and want to express their concern about not being heard, about their worries. That argument always has an argument about there's too many, too fast people, maybe immigrants, maybe minorities in general, maybe particular groups, that the problem with having too many people too fast coming into a society, is they'll take things that the people of that society would have thought were theirs, as there'll be a competition for resources, that there'll be a clash of identities because the people who come in might be different to the people who are already there, and there'll be a clash about who gets heard and who gets listened to. And then a really important part of this sort of concern, skepticism, populism argument of wanting to be heard is the feeling that it gets shut down as soon as it says this. We're not even allowed to make any of these points about the future of our country because people just assume we're being nasty and mean and racist, and so we get closed down. But actually, we want to say this in our democracies. That's an anti-argument. There are people who have the opposite view to that, and they struggle with that because it's a ferocious argument, and they're a bit worried about how to respond to it. And then the people at the more liberal end of the debate tend to say things like, well, we've always had a lot of immigration, think back over the centuries, it's part of who we are now. And then to take the people who come in take things away from other people, I'll say, no, people who come in create things for other people. There's a net contribution. Look, I've done some maths at the Treasury, and, don't worry, the taxation is paying for the services. We should be lucky. We're lucky to have this immigration. And culture as well. Isn't diversity good? You think it's bad, but I think it's good. Imagine this country if we didn't have curry and food from around the world. Come on, don't be so miserable about it. And I don't like the way you're talking about it because there's a lot of racism and prejudice in this debate. So I hear you don't want to be called racist, but it sounded a bit racist to me. You want to talk about this. Can we talk about something else, please? We seem to talk about this too much. So there's a kind of clash of views there between the unheard view about the skepticism, the what's there to worry about really view of the positive people. There's not going to be much dialogue between these people. They can go and vote in referendums and elections for very different political parties. What do we do about that kind of debate? Well, obviously, I would say, each of those camps kind of appeals to possibly a quarter of our society. The undergraduates and graduates at King's College are more likely to be in the more positive group, I think, than older people who didn't get to go to university and people who've grown up with diversity. But many people can hear some of those points and think the truth is somewhere in between, but would tend not to want to sort of spend too much of their time sort of refereeing that debate on the internet and saying you've both got half a point really, can't we all get along? I mean, I try to do this, but it's it's hard work. So what do we do about that? I just want to give some very brief signposts to how people who've got bits of those views or the in-between views, because most people are actually balancers about immigration. They think we should make choices about immigration, we should have some control over it. They also think it's very good in some ways for our universities or for our health service. They also think that when there is a lot of immigration at a high rate, it can have pressures on housing. They also think that the people who come in should be treated fairly, but the community should. So lots of people have a kind of both and up to a point of view, but that will tend to get crowded out of this kind of political clash. I'm going to just very briefly give you 4 or 5 kind of ideas about how to have a dialogue, even though the debate is quite polarised and quite different. So I think we've got to give the worried about it group a clear voice and to say it's legitimate, not illegitimate, to talk about immigration. I'm not going to call you racist because you're worried about the scale of immigration, etc. There's a deal here. If you can talk about your worries about it without being racist, can we make a deal there that I'll have the debate about the pressures of change, the numbers, where the resource going, how governments are handling it, but I don't want the debate where all of the people who come to our country are inherently a threat to the people already here. Let's work out what that boundary is. But there are going to be legitimate concerns about immigration. There are going to be some illegitimate concerns too, i.e. can the sort of mainstream version of that argument also keep away from this debate the people who are bringing, a more hateful and xenophobic argument if their voice is heard. That's what I'm trying to start with. So clearly, it's a democratic debate. It's going to be about the arguments you make in public, on the radio, how you vote in Parliament. It's not going to be about violence, intimidation, and threat. And so when we see sort of rioting in the streets and threatening people who are seeking asylum to get them out of hotels you don't want them in your town, that's clearly crossed the line. But you can be worried about how we're handling asylum. Here's a big ask of both sides of the debate, but maybe especially the more sceptical side. We can have a debate about what we should do now, and it should be about our choices in 2025. It shouldn't be about our choices in 2016 or 1968. My dad came the week after Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech to this country. The speech was saying he should go home, the Commonwealth migrants should go home. They shouldn't have children here because the children, people like me, will be funeral sticks. It will be sticks on the funeral pyre of Britain. That was quite tough an argument then. If you're still saying that now, if you're still saying the thing is we need, people born here like Sunder to get out, remigration, you need to change the past. Enoch Powell was right. Sort of 50 years on, that's an extreme view. If you're saying I want to change the rules, I want to vote for Brexit and end free movement, have some new rules, or I want to reduce immigration tomorrow, by having net migration at a lower level or a higher level, that's legitimate. The future, not the past. That's one of my tests. And then another related test, really. Can we talk about immigration? So somebody who's been here 10 generations, somebody like me whose parents came here from India and Ireland, but I was born here, somebody who came here 20 years ago and has been British, somebody who's been here a year or two, can they all have a voice in this debate rather than choosing who we talk to? So when Margaret Thatcher said in a version of this debate in sort of 1978, 79, some people feel swamped by people with a very different culture. She was only talking to the white British people who might feel swamped by the Asians. There wasn't an opportunity as a sort of British Asian to be part of co-producing the solution of the Britain in which we feel shared. Whereas if you said, look, some people feel the pace of change is too high, but we've got to be fair to people who come in, how does integration work for everybody? That would be my test of politicians. I think it's a test the Prime Minister didn't do very well at last week, actually, in the way he talked about integration. He would want to pass that test, I think. But when he's saying, like, I'll get a grip, the number's too high, I'll get it down, I'll select the people who want to come, I'll have integration, that could work across groups. But it didn't feel to me, even though he would say he was trying to speak for integration, not for segregation, it didn't feel to me like he was addressing all of the groups, the people who'd come, the children of migrants, the migrants themselves, the people who were worried about immigration at once. It felt like he was picking a group to speak to, and so I think his policy was more balanced than his language. So that fails the test. And my final point is we've all got a voice in this debate, but none of us are going to get all of the policy we want. Nigel Farage would like net migration to be net zero, and other people would say, I don't want it to be as low as that because that will be harmful to the universities and the health service. And so no one's going to get everything they want, but everyone's got to respect the voices of the other people that remain within the boundaries. So those are my thoughts about how we could argue better, and not everyone is going to take that deal, because some people are going to want to say, I don't want to hear anything from the people who want to reduce immigration. I think it's all stupid and wrong. They should look at the benefits and shut up. And other people are going to say, no, I don't want the migrants and the minorities to have a voice as well as people who are over here. It's our country, not theirs. But I think in the Britain of 2025, most people would like this kind of argument. So my criticism of the Liberal side, I'm empathetic to the Liberal side more than the anti-side, but I'm trying to find the bridging side. My criticism of the Liberal side is that they don't listen well enough to the argument they're countering, and they come up with arguments that work for the people who already agreed and don't work for the people who are somewhere in the middle. And that is because those arguments, those rebuttal arguments, isn't diversity good, look at the net contributions, they are, in fact, they are good for us arguments to counter a they are bad for us arguments. And I think we would argue better if we got over they are bad for us and they are good for us to how do people become us, because we actually all need to be the us we are now, and therefore the children of migrants, the children of people who aren't migrants have to co-create the future of a society that is fair to people who come to contribute to our society and fair to the communities they join. Most people in that shouting match don't ever think we're going to get there, but there would be a big appetite to argue better if we said that was the goal. Thank you.
Okay, my turn. As Bobby said right at the start, immigration is sort of emblematic. It's one of the themes that is emblematic of the problem, of why it seems harder today to have reasonable arguments between people of good faith. And I think that is for one big and in a way quite simple reason, is that the centre of gravity of politics over the last 20 years or so has sort of shifted from the sort of classic post-war socio-economic basis of political conflict and argument based on social class and arguments about state and market. It's shifted, I mean, those arguments haven't gone away, but it's kind of shifted substantially to the security and identity issues, as Sunder was saying, and immigration, national sovereignty, group attachments of various kinds. And these issues are both more emotional, obviously, but also they're harder to compromise on. When we go back to the kind of socioeconomic domination of politics, the left want taxes on the rich to increase by X percent, the right want them to increase or decrease, and you come to some sort of point in the middle. It's sort of splitting the difference seemed easier. And of course, emotional issues like immigration, national sovereignty, and group attachment are not really susceptible to sort of to data, or decisive sort of data doesn't win you the argument, because they're connected with people's feelings and emotions and political identities. So, I mean, having said that, I mean, arguing well has always been hard. I mean, free speech is not a sort of natural state of human beings. We're tribal people. We're all inclined to groupthink. We're particularly in the kind of the modern age. I think we're particularly susceptible to sort of what one might call block think too. That if you believe A, you have to believe B, C, and D. Even if it's wholly illogical. So supporters of the Green Party ought really to be quite sceptical about mass immigration. Environmentalists ought to be quite sceptical about mass immigration, because you're bringing people, on the whole, if you're bringing them from poor countries, you're bringing them from low carbon footprint countries to high carbon footprint countries. On the right, free marketeers who are often have an emotional attachment to national communities and communities in general, are kind of living a contradiction there. I mean, deregulation and free markets are often very destructive of stable communities. So you've got groupthink, you've got blockthink, obviously you've got confirmation bias, and people argue that this has become worse, and I think in the kind of new media world, and I think there is some evidence for that. I mean, I'm on a few WhatsApp groups, and I do kind of notice, they tend to be all like-minded people, and you kind of notice that, gradually over time, the loudest and most radical voices tend to come to dominate the conversation. But I think we shouldn't be too ahistorical about this. I mean, obviously there were huge divisions that existed before our current arguments. The old media were divided too. Indeed, there's an argument for saying that what's different about modern social media and all the platforms that people are on is that, unlike the old days when, the Guardian readers were in their Guardian reader group, the Telegraph readers were in their Telegraph readers group, and they mixed, broadly speaking, in the same kind of social circles, and they didn't often meet. And actually, the platforms brings people together to have these furious rows because the Guardian people and the Telegraph people are in the same space. And of course, we've also removed the, for want of a better term, sort of elite filter from modern mass communications. And that has many good things to be said about it. People, ordinary people who wouldn't normally be writing op-eds in the Times, still have a voice, because they may have a very large number of followers. I actually read a story in one of the, I think it may even have been in the FT, about how easy it is for prisoners to escape from these tags. I mean, as they're trying to bring the prison population down, there's a kind of increase in the number of people who perhaps should be in prison but have been released, but have these tags to control their movement and monitor them. And apparently it's incredibly easy just to cut them off. And there was this woman who had cut off her tag and gone on holiday to somewhere in Spain, and she was taking pictures of herself downing cocktails in a Spanish resort, and she had 270,000 followers on TikTok. And I actually went to look up what the circulation these days of national newspapers are, and only about 3 have a circulation higher than 270,000. Now, whether that's but I suddenly kind of, I had a sort of epiphany about how, this is not just about Substacks and WhatsApp and Twitter, but the huge following that lots of ordinary, or perhaps rather extraordinary, in this case, people have, which kind of wasn't true before. You just spoke to your friends and family and the people you met in the pub. But now, if you're kind of colourful and express yourself in an interesting way, you can get these followings of hundreds of thousands. And a lot of what happens there is a kind of amplified version of what used to go on in the pub. The conversation is much more raw, perhaps often much more prejudiced than it would have been if it had gone through the historic media filter. Briefly on immigration, I agree with a lot of what Sunder said. I think the white paper, last week's white paper, kind of essentially ended the debate on immigration, at least for the time being, because it essentially endorsed the argument that people like me, a mass immigration skeptic, has been making for the last 20 years. Cultural change is too fast, island of strangers, the economic benefits have been exaggerated, the costs have been underestimated, far too much abuse of visas, etc., etc. And there are very good reasons for that, because Reform are doing very well in the polls. Obviously, the Labour Party is the more pro-mass immigration of the big parties. But we have moved very, very rapidly. I think at the turn of the century, correct me if I'm wrong, Sunder, at the turn of the century, the ethnic minority population of England was probably about 8 to 10%. It's now closer to 30%. That is a very, very rapid change in a very short period of time. And there is a very wide consensus now that we should bring numbers down, particularly in the light of the so-called Boris wave, the huge increase of 2023 and 2024, where there is, I think, consensus, and where, I think, your point about sort of trade-offs and giving everybody a slice of the cake in the argument. Obviously, we need to, if we're reducing immigration, we needed to do it in a way that minimizes the economic damage, the damage to higher education, the damage to the care system, or whatever. And also, I do think that it could be made more palatable, that this, I think, absolutely necessary and overdue reduction could be made more palatable to people on the left. If Starmer was to talk up the idea of a really powerful labour inspectorate, something we've never really had in this country, something with teeth that would be looking out for modern slavery, for abuses by employers of the minimum wage, as well as visa compliance. And the other thing that I think is there to be, as it were, given to the more liberal side of the debate, is a change in the way we talk about the numbers. I disagree with, Sunder tends to say people are mainly interested in control, they're not that bothered about the numbers. I think when the numbers get up to the levels they've been at recently, people are quite large majorities are worried about the numbers. But we do tend to focus very much on this slightly random figure of net migration based on the kind of the United Nations official definition of an immigrant of someone who's in a country for a year or more. And given that a huge amount of our immigration is temporary, it seems, you have these frightening numbers, like, net immigration of 900,000 in 2023. The number of people in that year who got indefinite leave to remain in the UK was 120,000. I mean, that obviously reflected the numbers from 5 years earlier, given that it was at least until the potential change in the white paper, you can be in the country for 5 years before you can apply for indefinite leave to remain. 120,000 is a lot less frightening than 900,000. Now, it's true, as the mass immigration skeptics would say, if you have 500,000, whatever it is, every year, that is kind of the same as a permanent cohort of people. But I still think we should have parallel data to the. I mean, we will still have to have the kind of official statistics as they are. And by the way, most other countries, even in Europe, don't they focus overwhelmingly on illegal immigration? I met a German MP a couple of years ago who was interested in immigration. He was on some migration committee of the Bundestag, and I said to him, what was German net immigration last year? He had absolutely no idea, because there's very, very little focus on net immigration. There is only a focus on illegal immigration. So I think that's probably enough from me for now. I mean, a final point, I do find there is still the great sort of fault of the left in this argument is the moralising. And I was just reading the paper today, and a quote from Keir Starmer saying, Labour has a moral responsibility to make sure Farage never wins. Well, no, he doesn't. I mean, why? He has a political responsibility because he has a different set of views to Farage. But this is still sort of painting Farage as if he's Hitler, and Farage is not Hitler. So, yeah, that's enough from me.
Well, thank you, colleagues. I feel as if after listening to David, we've already hit on some small point of consensus, actually, which I'm hoping we'll get more of as the evening continues, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was conflating one sort of thing with another. And your remark about the number of people who are coming to the UK for a relatively short amount of time, being bundled in together with this global figure, really gets to the heart of that. So I think that's quite interesting if we reflect on the way in which the debate's conducted at a national level in terms of these huge numbers. And we're sitting in a university, and one of the things that's been very hard to understand for several years now, for example, is why people who come to the UK to study for a relatively short amount of time are bundled in with all of the rest of the immigration figures. That should be clearly disaggregated. Clearly there are various types of visas which mean that people can remain after their course, both for undergraduates and graduates. That's a huge political argument about how long that should be for, whether it's the right way to handle it, whether dependents should be allowed as well, all of that stuff. But I think we can agree that that's a completely different sort of migration from, for example, refugees and asylum seekers. But one of my real problems with the way the debate's been conducted with increasing sort of heat over the last couple of years is this tendency to conflate a lot of different sorts of migration. And I think it gets us not very far. What I'd actually done, if you'll sort of allow me, was I'd made a little list of kind of original sins that are sort of committed in the immigration debate. Well, what I think are sort of debating sins, and I don't know if my colleagues will agree with me about them, but if we're going to have a productive debate about the future and about the us that Sunder referred to, and about how we sort of move on and design an immigration policy for the UK that certainly a majority, if not all people, can support, then I think we do need to sort of abandon some of these sins committed in the debate. One is a very obvious one, which is erecting a straw man to, ridicule your opponent's views. And I think one of the most obvious examples of that is for people on the right to say that Labour is in favour of open borders, for example, or that Liberals are in favour of open borders. Things being what they are, I think you'd find it really quite hard to find a single MP in the House of Commons, actually, these days, who was in favour of open borders. And so it always depresses me when I see that accusation flying around on late night shows. I suppose the opposite version of that has already been sort of flagged, which is to shut down somebody's opinions by saying, well, you're beyond the pale, your language is beyond the pale, and that indicates your views are beyond the pale. Clearly, some people are actually actively racist in their opinions, but I think I'm right in saying, I was reading a piece of David's from the weekend, which is very interesting. I think you said that there's, 6% of the British, only 6% of the British public actually think you have to be white to be British, for example, to be truly British. So, this sort of straw manning to sort of shut down and think that you don't have to listen to the other side. Another thing I think that goes on in a slightly more subtle way is, labelling your opponents in sort of socioeconomic terms or political terms, again, so that you don't have to listen to their arguments or point of view. And I think there's still a lot of that does go on in quite subtle and indeed clever, witty ways. And, these are sort of rhetorical flourishes that people like me, journalists, love, right? Because once you've invented a sort of stereotype, people think, oh yeah, I know. I absolutely recognize that type. But again, it can be a way of actually just delegitimizing that person's viewpoint or indeed their real experience of how this issue affects them. And I would say one way in which that's happened in the past is to sort of, it's like that famous argument about GDP. Do you remember? And I think it was it the 2017 election?
No, I think it was Brexit.
Was it the Brexit argument?
That's not my GDP.
That's right, which I think actually that sums up where we are in politics as a whole. There's a guy basically in the street being vox popped saying, well, it's all very well you saying this adds to the nation's economic growth. It's your GDP, it's not my GDP. So anything, I think, which either completely paints economic arguments as irrelevant, because actually whether the country's prospering and growing does matter to all of it, not least because it pays for the flipping NHS. It does matter. So you shouldn't delegitimize those economic arguments, but you also certainly shouldn't be dismissive of a guy who feels, perhaps his earning power, his status in the community as somebody with high earning power as being affected in ways that someone else doesn't really understand. So I think that's one of these original sins as well. Conflating issues, I've already said, asylum is not the same as small boats. It certainly isn't the same as the skill shortages in the NHS and social care. It's not the same as international student migration. It's not the same as whatever succeeds the Erasmus scheme. It's insane to have a conversation. We know from the detailed polling that Bobby will, I think, back me up on this. We know from the detailed polling that the public absolutely has different views about these different categories of people coming to the UK. I think bankers are now quite unpopular. I think the bankers are, and actually, interestingly, international students have actually sort of fallen down in terms of general levels of approval. But it's still not the same as people's upset about small boats. So I think conflating it all is a disaster. And lastly, I think ignoring complexity about the sort of general social problems that we face as a country. I, for example, in David's excellent piece from the weekend, which I've already recommended to you, I think it's a very sort of appropriate upsum in many, many ways about a feeling of disquiet in the UK, a feeling of unease, malaise, a feeling of being unsure whether our communities are holding together. Really complex things that have happened to us after COVID, after the financial crash, after the cuts to public services during the austerity years. now the sort of global uncertainty, I think it's really, really complex why people are feeling this level of disquiet. And indeed, you used the word alienation, I think, in your piece, didn't you? And I think actually some of this diagnosis is right. I'm just, again, uneasy about kind of confusing a lot of different complex things that are going on and maybe correlated with a rise in immigration, and saying, well, the reason people are feeling that our high trust society is now turning into a low trust society, we'll look at these numbers on immigration. I think there are a lot of complex things adding to these social ills, and I would like to have a proper conversation about where we go from here on community, on making a healthy society, yes, on citizenship actually, on what makes somebody a British citizen, and how why should they want that and want to belong here and feel they belong here, and whether we have healthy relationships. I'm very uneasy about the way that is brought into the immigration debate as if this is the root of the problem. I think that's probably enough from me as well, isn't it? But anyway, I like the idea of co-producing a solution, whichever of you, my colleague said that.
Really great, amazing. What brilliant contributions, and sticking to the theme and focus for the event. So thank you so much for that. I've just got two quick observations, and then I'm going to actually just come back down the panel to allow people to react to each other's in a second. I mean, first, it was Anand Menon who had "That's not my GDP" shouted at him at an event in Newcastle, which he tells it. It was Anand Menon, and then it got reported a lot after that. So you're right, David, it was on the eve of the Brexit vote, but it was quite totemic after that. So yes, Anand of King's College was at the heart of that. Just one reflection on a point David made, which I think is important in this context, from the academic work on that really important point about how things are more emotional now, because it isn't about trade-offs in tax and spend so much. I mean, there is really good evidence on this. So Peter Hall did some work that looked at all the manifestos from 21 European countries over the last 50 years. And it used to be that the majority of promises made were economic from the winning party, and now the majority of promises are cultural from the winning party. And it's kind of crossed over into more or less reverse. So we've had this shift over time where the debates, the arguments, the political arguments are much more around culture than they are economics. And I think it's a really important point about it's much more difficult to compromise on those things that tie into identity than a bit more tax or a bit more spend, a bit less tax and a bit more spend the other way around. So I think that is the case. This is not going to go away from the political discourse. So I'd just like to actually just go back down the panel, because you've all heard from each other a bit more now, and it'd be good to just get reactions to others, and then with maybe a little bit more focus, if we can, on how do we do it better. Because we've had some Sunder studies out with some of those sort of principles, and maybe examples of where it is done better, or things that we can learn from elsewhere. And then we'll come to the audience, because there's a very expert audience as well, so we can get your thoughts too. But general reactions to what others have said, coming back, Sunder, and particularly the looking forward on what do we do better.
So one of the challenges about doing it better is where that happens. So obviously it happens if you're having a referendum or an election, but you'll tend to have people talking to it. Where does it happen the rest of the time? So nobody's got this completely right. Like all sort of major sort of advanced democracies have this kind of split where, the people who went to university and the younger people with more liberal views, etc., have different views from people who live in the countryside about, the change, who gets heard and so on. But it's how you manage that. I mean, a couple of countries have historically done better at the kind of sense of voice about this, the sense of control and what you're choosing, and they're Canada and Australia. And even though they've done better historically, they're having the same kind of debate we are having, because they had big surges. Ours was about Brexit and after Brexit, but they were having big surges after the pandemic. They're managing it down. Interestingly, they both have more processes about numbers and the attempt to be rational. And I think it's a very emotional debate, but there's actually a case for being more rational about the bits that are rational. Which visas do you want to give out? How many do you want to give out? Now, Canada and Australia have tended to target increases in immigration historically. So Australia has a reputation in this country of having a lot of control. People know people who've gone to Australia, been through it, but actually they have a much higher level of immigration in the society and much higher levels for their population. But they were targeting it. And these days they're targeting a decrease. What was interesting in the general election is the Labour government that got re-elected, they'd had a big surge, much bigger than ours actually. And then they said, well, we'll try and bring that down by about half because it is a bit high for housing. And they didn't quite hit their target. And the opposition said, well, whatever they've done, we'll be 100,000 lower because it'll never be enough in the way that, you know, they were the right-wing party. But because they had this policy process that's a bit like a budget or a spending review about, like, you know, okay, where are you doing it? The guy saying, well, whatever they've done, we'll have 100,000 lower. He was asked, how are you going to do it? You're not going to get rid of the backpackers, are you? Because we need the backpackers out in the rural areas. He said, no, I'll leave the backpackers. And by the time he'd said what he wasn't going to do, everyone said, your numbers don't add up. So that was a good version of that debate. So if I was Keir Starmer, I'm talking very tough about my white paper, but my white paper is actually quite moderate. The immigration has reduced. I done a poll yesterday. The net migration figure's out tomorrow. And I've polled people to say, what's going to happen? And 10% of people think the numbers are going to fall. 60% of people think the numbers are going to go up again. Well, the number's going to fall a lot. The number's going to be down about 250,000. And so we're having this massive debate about these extraordinarily high levels of immigration. Absolutely nobody knows, because you won't find it on the BBC or in the newspapers, that actually it fell a lot. Now, it's partly because, you know, we're all very proud of letting a lot of Ukrainians in, but that isn't happening at that level. It's also that different changes were made. So I think he should have a policy that says, you know, I'll come to Parliament every year and say, this is what I'm keeping, this is what I'm not keeping. And if you want it to be a much lower number than I've said, or zero, show us your plans. So that would be one way for Parliament to have that debate. But I also think it'd be good to try and find spaces, and it's difficult because the people who like immigration and the people who don't like immigration do live in different institutions and different worlds. Try and have spaces where you try and see what you can agree on, what you disagree on.
We're reacting to each other, or we're just saying things that we forgot to say first time round. I mean, just on the, I think I would take issue with a little bit of what Sunder just said about the numbers. Well, to the extent the numbers are coming down, it will still be mainly the effect of the Rishi Sunak changes, particularly about bringing in relatives. But the OBR is predicting that for the foreseeable future, we're going to have net immigration of 400,000 to 500,000. I mean,
they're predicting 300, so it's about half the level at the general election.
Well, apparently they're revising it upwards. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I think one point we haven't really touched on, I think, is the kind of adversarialism of our political system. Now, all political systems are adversarial, and they should be up to a point. But I think Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, and a lot of Labour people were so overdoing it for the first sort of 6-8 months of the Labour government. The Tories this, the Tories that, this dreadful kind of inheritance. And there is actually so much consensus on all the major intractable issues that our society faces. Everybody agrees, everyone in the political class agrees that we need to increase private and public investment. Everybody agrees that we need to hack back the regulations that prevent us building houses and factories and laboratories. Everybody agrees we need to make the NHS work better. Everybody now agrees that we need to bring immigration down, either a lot or even more than a lot. And yet, and yet the language of, I mean, just, in the debate we're having here, I think we are so badly led by our current crop of politicians. And, we need a kind of new kind of politician in some ways. I mean, many years ago, I coined these terms for trying to understand populism. I wrote a book called The Road to Somewhere. I talked about the people from anywhere, the kind of liberal graduate class that Sunder's been talking about, and the people from somewhere who tend to be less well educated, whose identities were much more connected to group and place, and who were therefore much more discomforted about rapid social change. And I made various estimates looking at British social attitude surveys and other other opinion and value surveys. Somewhere, this was about 7 or 8 years ago, somewhere is about 40, 50% of the population, anywheres maybe 25, 30%. There was a big in-betweener group. There are different kinds of anywheres and somewheres. I mean, it sounds very simplistic and binary, and up to a point it is, because there is this worldview divide. In the piece that Miranda referred to, I talked about this kind of impasse. We're now in a situation where the somewheres of throughout Europe, taking populist parties, as it were, to represent somewheres, and obviously there are lots of somewheres who wouldn't vote for a populist party, but the populists are now strong enough, as it were, to curtail the liberalisation that the anywheres have promoted for the last 20 or 30 years, but they're not strong enough to dominate the society, and that is a good thing, because our politics, I think, that was the argument I made in The Road to Somewhere, there's nothing wrong with either the anywhere worldview or the somewhere worldview. The problem is that one of them has been over-dominant, and populism is a sort of democratic pushback against that over-domination of one set of views. And we don't want to move from, as it were, the kind of anywhere dictatorship to a somewhere dictatorship, God forbid. We want a rebalancing so that politics takes account of the somewhere voice more. But to do that, you need a new category of politician who can speak to both groups. And we just haven't yet, perhaps King's College could have a special institute to produce these kinds of politicians, because we need them.
Great idea. Thanks, David. Miranda.
I think King's College does have one of these, but it's just for women, right? Up the women. There is actually a very good female leadership institute here at King's, which is why I made that joke. So part of it, how do we go from here? Does anyone do it better? I do think there's a problem with the sort of short-term, panicky style of government that we've had here for several years. And I think the current government is already a kind of offender on that, and the previous governments were. And I'm not a fan. I have to say, I'm not a fan of Keir Starmer's language around the island of strangers introducing the white paper, because I think it's very emotive. It's true that these issues of how we feel about our community, how we feel about our nation, do tap into emotions for good reasons. I think just tapping into them sort of rhetorically is a bit cheap and verging on inflammatory, because sort of strangers, I mean, also, what does it even mean, I mean, somebody on my street might indeed be a stranger, but they're still my neighbour, So it's sort of incredibly sort of negative connotation that I think clearly does mean something to people, but some people. But I don't know. What do you think about that, David?
Just stick up for Keir on this. I mean, he didn't actually say we are an island of strangers. He said we're in danger of becoming one. And I think it was probably one of the very few things that would have cut through to the people that he was trying to say, I share your anxieties. I share, that your society, your neighbourhood has changed too fast and you feel worried about that. I'm kind of on your side. I think that's a kind of legitimate signal to send.
So here's the thing. I think it would be a legitimate signal to send if he had been that morning, for example, making a speech about community and integration and a sense of belonging, and here are some schemes that we are, going to encourage, I suppose, a bit more along the lines even of David Cameron's Big Society, that sort of theme. And in that context, I think the phrase is doing one job of work. I think in the context of a immigration white paper which they've been briefing us for 5 days previously is designed to land as tough talk, it's doing another job of work. And I think it's a bit sort of naive to think it can do both, given the context. So I do think the language is important, and so we should do better on that. But I do think, we're badly served by our political leaders, really. And actually, if you look at this argument we're having about the, 900,000, let's face it, that came about because of muddling through, and it's good old British muddling through, because in the post-Brexit years, the supply of skilled labour and lower skilled labour for various sectors was so dire that the Johnson government did decide to, oh my God, okay, we've got to actively recruit social care, we've got to actively recruit for various bits of the NHS where, I mean, I was having chemo during COVID, and all the chemo nurses, as a point of fact, were from the Iberian Peninsula. Post-Brexit, they weren't coming anymore, so they had to recruit from somewhere else, so all of a sudden all the chemo nurses were American. You know, this is a case of muddling through and then ending up with a political mess which you bequeath to your successors in government. And I think that sort of short-termism is a sort of curse of British politics. God knows what we do about that. And one other thing is that there have actually been several really interesting expert panels over actually in the 2000s on integration, on community cohesion. I'm thinking of Ted Cantle and the reports he did after the riots in the northern towns. Help me out, Bobby. Was it 2003? 2001. Okay. So Ted Cantle is still out there with good ideas. His reports have been completely shelved and never looked at again. You know, the RSA, when Matthew Taylor was chief executive there, he had a whole commission on, you know, integration, community cohesion. What does multiculturalism mean in practice? How do we make this work for everyone? Again, you know, nothing. We could be focusing on a whole rich agenda there, but we don't.
I just want to say something about the strangers argument and what people hear when we talk about immigration. Now, I don't think comparing Keir Starmer to Enoch Powell is a sensible thing to do. I mean, I take the Enoch Powell speech quite personally because it's basically saying send Sunder's dad home so Sunder can't be born, because that'll be the end of us all if that kind of thing happens. And what Keir Starmer is saying is something quite anodyne. When the pace changes so fast, I'd like integration, maybe I'm not getting it, you don't feel like it. So it's a more anodyne argument. I think it's very clumsy because I think he's using tougher language in his policy and so on. But actually, immigrant and the way we use it, we tend to mean sort of unfamiliar foreigner. We sort of mean stranger in how we imagine it. Because another way to use immigrant is person in this country, born not in this country. Well, now we're talking about a sixth of the people in our society. We're talking about a lot of people who aren't strangers to us. We're talking about my mum and dad, and we're talking about different colleagues, we're talking about a lot of people in the audience, but we don't then tend to think about the everyday story of the people we know and are familiar to us as immigrants, as opposed to the people we know. And this is why people who sort of talk about immigration a lot and then say to one of their neighbours, of course, I don't mean you, of course, because you're great, and so on, because you're a familiar person to me. So in a way, I think it is a kind of, it's a sort of stranger and fear category word, and actually we've got to work a bit harder, I think, on the everyday realities. Actually, people, you know, think the levels are quite high, but we're much more pro-migrant than we were as a society than we were 50 years ago, just because from a younger age, more people have got those relationships than would have been the true for people longer. Because that's an opportunity to balance the debate more, because the familiarity of people, it's stronger in the areas of high diversity and high migration than it is in the areas of low migration, because they're the places where people are familiar to other people.
Great, thank you. Anything else from the panel? I think we've got microphones, have we, for audience questions while they're getting there? Anything else people wanted to pick up and come back on? Oh, you can use that one. Yeah, take that one. Anything from the panel? No? Well, let's see what we get from the audience. Oh, you have to go all the way straight back. That was the first hand I saw. Sorry. Okay, you can give it to that one. That's great. And one right at the back, because I saw that hand first.
Shall I do me?
No, you go ahead.
Okay,
go
thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah.
So obviously I've listened and I understand your views and the arguments. One of the things, I've got so many questions, but I'm only going to do one, I promise you, right? But in my head, I often think to myself, why don't we talk about the 1.7 billion that was created in 23 and 24 that went to the NHS by virtue of the immigration health surcharge that is charged to skilled workers? We don't talk about that. And I think if we did talk about it, you'd get perhaps a different reaction from the British public. What are your views about that?
Great. Thank you very much. Great question. And we'll take two or three, so let's have the one at the back.
Thank you very much. My name's Alice Taylor. I work at King's College London as a professor of medieval history. And I was very interested in... I'd like to ask the panel not just about the topic, about how we argue, but going off something that Sunder said, which is that we need a different way of communicating, and maybe that's a move to co-production. So I'd like to ask the panel specifically that given that we are in a very, very different world, technologically, communicatively, how would they argue differently now than they did maybe in 2017 when they wrote a book, or in 2014 when they started writing articles?
Great.
What is a better way to argue about this topic? What is a better way to move towards a co-production, if indeed that is a potential goal?
Excellent, thank you. We'll see if there's one more anywhere. Yes, can we go to the middle there? Thank you. Yes, thank you.
So I feel like you guys are talking about polarization in terms of how polarized the discussion around migration is, especially on social media, for example. And I think a large part of that is because so many people care so strongly about immigration because it feels like it's a very personal problem and it's something that affects them. And so my question is that something that we should take out of the debate when we argue immigration? Should we be talking personally about how we feel about it emotionally, or would it be better to just cut the emotion out of it and talk numbers and talk economics? And in that frame of mind, is talking about it personally not an important part, because I think it helps breed empathy, because we talk about immigration, we talk about our family or our friends, whether that's in terms of our family or friends being immigrants and we want them to stay in the country, or on the other hand of people who might think that their family and friends might be, I don't know, that it might affect them in a bad way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my question.
Great question too. So we got three there. One about the 1.7 billion surcharge, one about better ways of communicating, and the kind of polarization one around emotion versus and personal connection versus fact. Maybe if we just go through the panel.
It's a really excellent point about the surcharge. You know, these things are introduced to give people confidence that, you know, the pressures are being dealt with, and then people haven't heard of them. So, I mean, people don't know about that surcharge. It was £200, then it was £600, then it's £1,000 per person. So if we cut immigration, we'll be taking money out of the health service because of the thing that people are being charged by, and yet people are still worrying about the health service. So I think if the politicians did it for that reason, they should communicate it. I think there's a link between the points. So numbers, which are big, are kind of frightening. And then faces and voices and conversation are empathy engendering, and so on. And you just have a different conversation when you turn the numbers into voices and faces, and that's the answer to the sort of how to have a different conversation. If I took the same group of a dozen citizens with views and I put them sort of behind text-based communication, asked them to discuss it, they would go at each other about it. But if I put the same people on a Zoom call with their cameras on, or if I put them in an actual room together, they would work very, very hard at perspective taking and hearing the point and saying, I see what you're saying. And actually our debate has improved so we had a debate about Brexit, we had a referendum, we voted to leave, and people thought the numbers were too high. And then the next morning, 1 million people in this country who come from Poland were very worried about what it meant for them. And it turned out that lots of the people who'd voted to leave, most of them, except for the very extreme people, thought that they didn't want them to be worried and that they want to change the rules in future, because they took voices. We worry a lot about illegal immigration and rules and not illegality. And then the Windrush scandal shocked people, because how you apply those rules if you don't do it properly has a human cost. So I think the answer is to bring the emotion in, not to take the emotion out, because I think it gives you that perspective-taking conversation. The right way to have the debate, however much is going on, is to try and make people attempt to still make their point. And this country is a bit different to America and France, because it's basically quite conflict-averse most of the time. And so in a way, after Brexit, we've been trying to take the temperature out, although some people still want to do it, whereas actually what's happening in America is because people blame the other side so much, they're always happy to have the next round of the argument. So I think we could lean into our conflict aversion, which is essentially saying that people would like a kind of, let's put the kettle on, listen to each other and see how far we get. And for a lot of people, they would then feel heard. And, people who wanted to cut the numbers didn't feel heard, but people who feel they're being stereotyped in this debate when they've come here, worked hard in this country, they don't feel heard either. So, maybe it's possible for different people to be heard at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, sort of bouncing off the questions and what Sunder just said, I mean, I actually think we do, as you were kind of implying, I think we actually have a better debate about immigration now than we did, say, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I wrote a piece in Prospect, if you remember, called Too Diverse? It was kind of investigating the tension between diversity and solidarity, suggesting, that accepting the common sense idea that people are ready to trust people, to trust and share with people they have something in common with, that people on the centre-left should be kind of aware of this tension. It was reprinted in The Guardian, it caused the great furore, I was accused of being a racist, and that wouldn't happen today. I mean, I think we're in a much better position. I mean, that was still the sort of butt end of a period when any questioning in a lot of the mainstream media, not necessarily all of it, but a lot of any questioning of levels of immigration or whatever was considered sort of beyond the pale. The debate today is much more open, much more raucous, in some corners of the internet, no doubt more unpleasant. But, as Miranda was saying, only 6% of British people think that you have to be white to be truly British. I think, there's a sort of safety net under which this debate takes place. I think we're pro-immigrant but anti-mass immigration, and that's not that is not a contradiction to take that position. I mean the point somebody made, the Boris. The Boris wave, I think, was the result of the Tories, perhaps particularly Boris, they're also an anywhere party. They're enthralled to this argument that Brexit was somehow an expression of collective bigotry. So they were desperate to prove that we are global Britain. So they didn't think very hard about the various openings that they introduced to making it much easier for people to bring for students and for like 75% of the Boris wave is international students and health and mainly care visas. 75% of it, and they weren't close enough to the small print. I mean, obviously they didn't expect it to balloon in the way that it did. And they're now doing their best, or another party is doing its best to sort of stuff it back in the bottle. But underlying both of those, both the huge increase in international students and the health and care visas, underlying both of them is our national short-termism, our inability to invest properly in the health and care system and the university system. We're getting both on the cheap thanks to mass immigration. 25% of university income comes from international students, which has allowed the system, obviously not the elite universities like King's, but kind of lower down the food chain. You've had this huge over-expansion of higher education, partly sustained by people coming, doing one-year course, using them as work visas essentially, and the same with health service. Nearly 50% of our hospital doctors were trained abroad. I mean, it's appalling morally. I mean, a very large proportion of them come from really poor countries. Nursing, we've made a graduate-only profession. I mean, there's a lot to be said for having more graduate nurses, but it should be easier for people who aren't necessarily very good at passing exams at school to become nurses, maybe make the training a bit longer or whatever. We just haven't invested enough in these things, and we've become over-dependent on migration, and now we have to do it slowly so that we don't cause too many universities to close. One or two closing wouldn't be a bad thing. We have to do it so that we still have enough people in the care system. Why not pay care workers £1 or £1.50 above the minimum wage? It would cost about £1 billion. People who are coming in from low-income countries are going to cost the Treasury more in the longer run. It's it's short-termism again.
Miranda.
Well, I have so many reactions to what David just said that I'm actually not going to bother, because I completely disagree with you about universities. I completely disagree with you about social care. But let's just park that for perhaps another evening of debate, because to the questions from the audience, I actually don't think anybody knows about those fees coming into the NHS exactly, which I imagine is your point. So when governments actually do try to introduce something that builds a feeling of solidarity and contribution, flipping well talk about it is absolutely mad. What methods of co-production? Well, I tell you what, I actually think this is way harder than Sunder's put the kettle on vision makes it sound. Partly I say this because I'm actually involved in a podcast at the moment with 3 other people from across political journalism of very, very different political viewpoints. And we had a big podcast recording last week on immigration off the back of the white paper launch. And we stayed friends by the end of the hour, but only flipping just, because it is very emotionally charged. And I think it's really hard because people are very, very wedded to their starting point. Clearly, we have a better debate than we did 20, 25 years ago, and moved on from the Enoch Powell era, thank God. But I think it is still really emotionally charged, and I think it is quite hard. And to your point about the emotion, I think I agree with Sunder, actually, because unless you actually explain the origins of your emotion, it's all too easy to dismiss the other side as in some sort of straw man way. I mean, I feel strongly about the social care conversation because I'm coping with my mum who's 91 and trying to combine working, looking after my children, and somebody of 91 who can't even make themselves a cup of tea. This is a real problem for families, the social care system being broken. And, somebody running a university in a provincial city where a huge proportion of the local economy is dependent on that university might take exception to your remarks that it'd be good if a couple of universities closed.
Why not?
And not least because they're probably training the next generation.
Why not turn it into a vocational college rather than an academic university?
Well, I'd just like to point out that a vast percentage of university expansion in this country in recent years has actually been for vocational courses, not least in healthcare. So they're actually doing what you want them to do. They're just not labelled as institutions in the way that you want them to be labelled.
So the next in our series is how to argue about universities.
Yes.
Which we will come back to. We'll come back to on that. I do want to. We're only going to take 2 more questions, I think. But I've got one of my own, which is a bit selfish. But I do think Miranda's point about put the kettle on, and points to a broader thing about what structures actually end up supporting that greater direct contact and discussion about this. And I'm asking this as one of the questions so you can kind of come back to it and we take the other 2. But, we have a lot of focus on deliberative democracy and bringing people more into these types of discussions, citizens' assemblies, those types of things, because we've lost a lot of other forums in which people can talk across boundaries. But is deliberative democracy really going to be an answer to these types of, very wide-ranging, very emotional and myriad debate? So it would be good to actually get from, yes, we know that contact theory works, yes, we know that people are more reasonable together when they can do it, but how do you get that actually to work at scale in our much more atomized society? So it'd be good to come, if there's any practical thoughts on that in the panel, but also in the audience, actually. So I'm going to take 2 actual questions. Oh, my God, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Where are the microphones that are at the back? So I did see your hand first at the back. Yes, you. Yes, that's great. And have I not covered an area? I did see you at second, actually. So sorry, there's one round here. Maybe we do need to take 3, and then we'll call it a day. So you take your question first, yeah?
Okay, yeah. As someone who has navigated the UK's immigration system from Tier 2 to British citizenship, my journey, like that of many others, has been shaped by policies often debated without our direct input. how can public debates, policy-making processes, and media narratives around immigration better include the voices and the lived experiences of migrants like me, especially those who work in essential sectors like health and care? What structures or shifts would you recommend to ensure that the people most affected are not just subjects of debate, but active participants in it?
Great question. Thank you very much. And here.
I'm Hannah, I'm from Demos, and I'm very glad you brought that up about deliberative democracy. Watch this space on how we do a good debate on this. But my question was, does the panel think this is one of those issues where it's very dominated by loud voices on the extreme end, and actually that there's like an unheard majority of people who sort of think immigration's all right under X conditions? And I say that just to give an example, and also a shameless plug of a report we published last week called The MIMBY Majority about planning, so a very different area, but kind of looking at how the conversation's really dominated by a small, loud minority who have really strong views, mostly anti-house buildings and NIMBYs. But actually, when you do kind of polling, you figured out most people are MIMBYs. You know, they say you can build houses in my backyard, but under these certain conditions, so say, I don't know, the infrastructure supports it. So do we think immigration is kind of one of those issues where there's a maybe majority that we're not really hearing from?
Great. Actually, I'll take those, and then we do have drinks and things afterwards, so people can mingle and ask their questions. So this is kind of final round of things. So deliberative democracy, making sure we've got active participation and voices being heard, and then a not unrelated question about we're only hearing the loud voices.
Yeah, so most people are balancers on this topic if you go out and talk to them, except on the internet, where most people are at the polarised end. I did an experiment once where, this was with the Home Affairs Select Committee, I went to 60 towns and cities and sat 10 citizens down to say, we've had this Brexit debate, we're going to have to do it. What was interesting was the moral seriousness with which people took the task, and we were looking at, the case of people who were outside the rules and what would happen, and just, they weren't deciding on someone's real case, they were deciding on a fictionalised version, but they were taking it incredibly seriously. And the people who did it were very proud of their ability to kind of do that with each other in the room, etc. But the people who filled in the online survey were completely the opposite, because they were sharing it with all their friends who had the same views of them, saying, look, we've all got to fill this in, or they'll listen to someone else. So it was just completely different. So the deliberative democracy stuff works, but actually it doesn't work. It's powerful if you did it, but it's no point like 600 people did this, but 60 million people didn't. So I would actually goggle box up the deliberative democracy and watch it. So, for example, it's the 9th anniversary of the referendum coming up. On the 10th anniversary, I think the BBC should get 100 people, take them off to, the Isle of Wight or somewhere in Portsmouth, Brexit Island, have that, and then, but not for like a day to sort it out, for like a month or something, to just sort of build relationships with each other, see how they get on, and 6 of those people should be people born abroad, so they're in the conversation with the people who strongly voted for it, the people, that would be a really interesting thing for the rest of us to see, because when you have, instead of sort of treating the lived experience of its own separate thing, you actually bring it together. So just another experiment of something I did. I went to Southampton and Edinburgh and got people who were born British and people who'd become British to go through together what the citizenship processes should be. Now, the people who were born British were really grateful for the people who'd become British, because we were making them do the history quiz. They didn't know it, but the people who'd learned the book did. But they started with the view that maybe all of this is a bit pointless, what's the point? Whereas the migrant citizens thought there was a point. They thought it could be much better, but they thought there was a point. So they were able to build a common ground about what is pointful and pointless about a citizenship process, and it was interesting to see. It will cost something, but we shouldn't rip people off. You should be tested on stuff that other people know, not tested on stuff that nobody knows. And so the people who've been through the citizenship process are a very good way of getting it right, not getting it wrong. And so I think we haven't done that, and we shouldn't think that getting it right is just for one group and not the other group.
Yeah, I think the migrant voice obviously should be heard, particularly over improving the no doubt incredibly clunky bureaucratic processes we have. Me and Sunder actually wrote a letter, didn't we, to the Times, I think, about the ridiculous cost of citizenship. We want people to become citizens, certainly once they have indefinite leave to remain, and we should be making it easier, not harder. Having said that, I mean, of course, migrants choose to come here. They are the beneficiaries of migration, otherwise they wouldn't stay, leaving aside asylum seekers. And the people who are already here, haven't been consulted about it. And as we've known from the opinion surveys, many of them are unhappy about it. So I would say to the demos question, this point that kind of the loud voices are all on the right, well, maybe, but the powerful voices are overwhelmingly on the liberal side of the argument. The government departments that I was talking about, the health department that desperately wants to, because we don't invest properly in the health service, it desperately wants to bring migrants in. The only department that sort of tries to hold the ring against is the Home Office, and they're famously incompetent. So the powerful people are they're in the universities, they're in the health system, they're in the court system. They are the people that run the country. They are the reason we had immigration of 900,000. Because, Boris's Tory party were in thrall to the idea of global Britain. The 900,000 is an expression, I'm afraid, of the anywhere dominance culturally and ideologically of our society. And we have a pushback against it, and we're now moving, I think, in a better direction.
Miranda.
So people who are becoming citizens of the UK, I personally would be fascinated if the UK decided to sort of behave a bit more like an organisation and sort of interview everybody on the way in, and also, frankly, interview everyone on the way out. Do you know what I mean? Like the ideal organisation has, do you know what I mean? It has kind of levers. Why are you leaving? Do you know what I mean? Why are you coming? Why are you leaving? That would be fascinating, don't you think, as a piece of research? You're coming to the UK, what's brought you here? What do you like about it? What would you change? What are you finding easy? That whole conversation, actually, I don't think it's been had. And similarly, if people are kind of giving up and leaving, particularly in our public services, the people who work there, why are you going? What's gone wrong? I think it would be a really, really good...
I mean, in most cases.
No, but there are plenty. I mean, you were talking about it as a scandal of how many doctors, nurses, and other medical staff in the NHS are trained elsewhere. What about the enormous problem of all the medical trainees here who are just leaving as soon as they've completed their training? I mean, we've got something really wrong with how we treat our workforce in the NHS, and we should think about that very seriously. You can't say we shouldn't be recruiting doctors from overseas when huge proportion of junior doctors are getting the hell out as soon as they can to go and work in Australia or the States or anywhere else that will give them a visa. We treat them really badly, and we don't appreciate our health workforce or our social care workforce, which is probably, again, something we probably agree on. So I think that would be a great exercise, actually. Somebody should fund some research, Bobby. The citizens... citizens' juries and deliberative democracy and all of that. I'm also much less keen on this idea of trying to find a consensus through a process. I actually think one of the great things about the UK and how we do politics, to be a bit more positive than we usually are, is that we don't just arrive at a settled view and nobody's ever allowed to talk about it again. The very fact that we're having this debate this evening means it's not a settled question. The last fiery immigration I had was in the few months after the Brexit vote in Sweden, where I went as a guest of Claire Fox and her Battle of Ideas. And we were having this kind of set to about immigration policy across Europe. And all of these Swedish people came up to us afterwards and said, this is absolutely extraordinary. We don't talk about this at all, because the way we run Swedish democracy is we kind of come to a settled view and then everyone must abide by it. I actually think that's a bit unhealthy, because things change, circumstances change.
That's why
you react to the...
Sweden. Yeah.
Right, no, I mean, I think there is a lot in that, actually. I think imposing an artificial consensus is not always ideal, and I think some of these processes can lead to that a bit. The other thing I would just like to say is that I think it's important to have young people's voices in all of this, because people who are growing up now in the way British society has evolved, do have a different understanding of a lot of these complex questions to older generations, and they're going to have to design the future where it works.
Great, thank you so much for that. Just a couple of very quick reflections. I think comment from the question around for a colleague from Demos was more about extreme voices on both sides dominating, and I think that is an important point in the sense of it, and it gives me a chance to plug our work on polarization and understanding models of polarization and how we become polarized and the processes by which that happens, which you kind of need to understand, where it is very reminiscent of Sunder's points about most people being somewhere in the middle, and lots of things about being on a spectrum on this, and not into these really hard and fast groups that we are set forever. And I think it's much more fluid and much more nuanced than we get across. And that's the main thrust of our work on culture wars and polarization, is to try to understand that. But then finally, I suppose the reflection is really useful comments and discussions on deliberative approaches, because I think what's really interesting about this series is that the organised Global Cultures Institute have framed it around how to argue about this, where it's not all about coming to consensus and a middle ground. And I think that's a very important and brave and useful way to frame a series. There's going to remain arguments, and we are not all going to agree on all of these kind of contentious topics, and understanding how you do that argument better rather than just doing it in order to set a consensus or find a common ground that we can agree on forever is really important. So thank you to the people organising this for that framing. I think this is not all about depolarisation or moves to come to some sort of settled consensus. It is about realising this is the reality. How do we do it better? So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, of course, mostly to our excellent panel.